Are you afraid of werewolves? When you find yourself at the edge of a forest, do you ever contemplate, as our ancestors once did, the horrors that lurk within, imperceptible by mortal eye, but ready to ensnare anyone foolhardy or unlucky enough to venture inside? Do you believe that there are forces beyond our comprehension, perhaps magical, perhaps celestial, or perhaps the product of raw human emotion, that can curse someone, change their form into something bestial, uncontrollable, forced to exist outside of society and even the laws of God? Or maybe it's not really werewolves themselves you're afraid of. Maybe it's the prospect of becoming one. You see, the point is often made that vampires can change into wolves, but the vampire has control and doesn't have to live with, and perhaps this is the real curse, the burden of morality, the realization that, as beasts, as that which represents the most base and vile aspects of our humanity, they have no control over their actions. So, let's listen to some werewolf, or even weremen, tales, and if you happen to find yourself on the night of a full moon suddenly losing hours of time, or forgetting your own actions, don't forget to lock and bar your bedroom door.
This is a passage from the Lays of Marie of France, written in the 12th century. Bisclavret, the werewolf. In ancient days, many stories were told of men who turned into wolves and made their dwelling in the wild. Each of them became the creature known as the werewolf. This is a savage beast which, as long as it remains in its animal form, goes around devouring people and causing harm, lurking in the depths of the forest. But let me tell you the particular story of the werewolf Bisclavret. In Brittany, there lived a nobleman of whom many good stories were told. He was a handsome and courageous knight who always bore himself with honor. He was one of those closest to his overlord, and was much admired by all his neighbors. He had married a woman who was herself noble and beautiful. As he loved her, so she loved him in return. But she became greatly concerned about the fact that every night he went away for 3 full days without her knowing what became of him. During this time, no one in their household knew what happened to him. And so one day, when he had returned home in great good humor, she broached the matter with him. "My lord," she said, "my own sweet love, I want to ask you something if I dare, but I am afraid above all of your fury." When he heard this, he kissed her, folding her in his arms and pressing her against him. "Come, my sweet lady," he said, "ask away. There is no question you can put to me for which I shall not provide an answer as long as I know it myself." "I am greatly relieved to hear this, by my faith," she said. "Indeed, my lord, I am so anxious on the days when you are absent. My heart weighs so heavy, and I am so afraid of losing you, that all of this will surely cause my death unless I soon get help. Do please tell me where you go off to and what happens to you. I fear you have another love, and in going to her you are doing wrong." "My lady," he said, "for God's sake have pity. For if I tell you about this, it will cause me great sorrow, for I will surely lose your love and end up losing my life." Listening to him, the lady realized how serious the matter was. She kept on questioning him, cajoling him so effectively that at last he told her the truth, keeping nothing back from her. "My lady, I go off to become a werewolf. As Bisclavret, I enter the depths of the forest and feed off whatever prey I can hunt down. When he had related everything to her, she asked him whether he went naked or kept on his human clothing. "My lady," he said, "I go about completely naked." "But for God's sake, tell me where you leave your clothes." "I cannot tell you that, alas! For if ever I lost them and remained without them, I would have to stay forever in the form of Bisclavret. There would be no help for me until I retrieved my clothes, and that is why I cannot reveal this." "But my lord," the lady objected, "you are dearer to me than the world itself. You must not conceal anything from me or mistrust me in this way. After all, that is not how it should be between true lovers. What have I done that you should have such doubts about me? Give me at least some indication, for it would be more sensible if you were to do so." She kept on chivying him in this way until at last he had no choice but to tell her. "At the edge of the forest, beside the path which I always take, there is an old chapel which often meets my need. There, underneath a copse, is a large boulder with a hollow at the center, where I always place my clothes until I come home." The lady reddened with alarm when she heard this astonishing news. She became deeply fearful and started to think of different ways she might separate from him, as she no longer wished to share a bed with him. She sent a message to a knight who lived nearby, who had always been in love with her, showing her his admiration by devoted and generous service. Until now she had never responded or given this knight cause for hope, but now she confided in him. "Rejoice, my friend," said her message. "Without further delay, I am ready to give you that which I have refused you until now, so causing you great torture. Never again will you be rebuffed, for I pledge you my body for love and wish to become your mistress." The knight sent his ardent thanks and accepted her pledge enthusiastically. She, in turn, received his oath of loving allegiance and went on to tell him about her husband and his wanderings as a wolf. She told him of the path leading into the forest and sent him off to fetch her husband's clothes. In this way, the werewolf Bisclavret was betrayed by his wife, who did him great wrong. Because he had been away so often in the past, everyone thought this time perhaps he had gone away forever. A search was mounted, inquiries were made, but eventually, when no trace had been found of him for a long time, the matter was left alone. The ardent knight married the woman he had so long admired. An entire year later, the king went out hunting and rode toward the forest where Bisclavret had his lair. When the hounds were let off the lead to hunt, they soon found the traces of Bisclavret. Pack and huntsmen spent a whole day tracking him until they brought him to bay and were on the verge of ripping him to pieces and putting an end to him. But as soon as the werewolf caught sight of the king, he loped forward toward him and pleaded for mercy. He seized the royal stirrup and kissed the king's foot. At the sight of Bisclavret, the king was terrified and summoned his retinue. "Come here, my lords. Look at the marvelous way this creature abases itself before me. It seems to be as intelligent as a human and to be pleading for mercy. Keep the hounds away and see that no one injures it. The beast has both intelligence and comprehension, and I shall bestow my protection upon it. Hurry, let us away, for I have had enough of hunting for today." The king then departed with Bisclavret at his heels. The werewolf stayed very close to the king, having no wish to leave him and be set apart from him. The king took him straight back to his castle and was filled with joy and delight at the day's events, for he had never come across such a thing before. He considered the wolf to be a great marvel, and he cherished it deeply, giving orders that it should be protected by all his people, and commanding that no harm should come to it. No one was to injure it, and it must be provided with food and water at all times. The king's servants were content to look after the creature, and every day it slept among the royal retinue of knights close beside the king himself. Everyone loved the werewolf, and so noble and docile was it that it never tried to cause any violence or harm. Everywhere the king went, the werewolf wanted to go also. It was his constant companion, and gave every sign of love and reverence for him. But listen to what happened next. The king held a great feast, summoning all the barons who held their fiefs by his permission to attend the celebrations and show by their presence their service to him. One of those who came, knitted out in magnificent apparel, was the knight who had married Bisclavret's wife. He was completely unaware and unsuspecting that Bisclavret was so near to him. When Bisclavret saw him on his arrival at the castle, he raced toward him and mauled him with his teeth, dragging him to the ground. Bisclavret would have seriously injured the knight if the king had not called him to heel and menaced him with a cane. Twice more that day he attempted to take a bite out of the knight. Many at the court were amazed at this, for never before had Bisclavret behaved like this toward anyone. Throughout the king's household, people said he would never have behaved like this without good reason. The knight must have done him some wrong or other, for he seemed to be determined to take revenge. But for a time, that was the end of the matter. The fief holders sought permission to depart, and it is my belief that the knight whom Bisclavret had mauled was among the first to go. It was hardly any wonder that Bisclavret loathed him so. As I heard the story, shortly afterwards the king in his wisdom and nobility went on a journey through the forest where Bisclavret had been tracked down. The werewolf went along with him, and on his return the king decided to stay for a night in that region. The wife of Bisclavret heard of this and, adorning herself with great elegance, set off next day to do homage to the king, taking him a costly gift. When Bisclavret caught sight of her, no one could hold him back. He lunged toward her as though he were insane, and listen to what vengeance he took upon her. He bit the nose from off her face. Was there a worse punishment that could have been inflicted on her? Everyone made as if to attack Bisclavret, and he was about to be torn apart when one of the courtiers, a man of great wisdom, said to the king, "Your Highness, listen to me. This creature has made its dwelling with you for a very long time, and all of us have consorted with it closely. Never before has he injured anyone or attempted violence except against this woman. I swear by the pledges I have given to you that he has some grievance against her and her present husband. She is the former wife of the nobleman whom you used to love so dearly, and who went away a long time ago without anyone knowing what happened to him. Ask this woman to tell you why this beast hates her. Get her to tell you everything she knows. After all, here in Brittany, we have been witness to many marvelous happenings." The king listened to what he said. Detaining the knight, he ordered the woman to be taken away and tortured. In her pain and terror, she revealed everything about her former husband. She told how she had betrayed him and stolen his clothing after he had given her an account of his wanderings as a werewolf. Since the theft of his clothing, he had not been seen again in the region. She was absolutely sure that the creature was Bisclavret himself. The king ordered her to bring the clothes, whether she liked it or not, and give them back to Bisclavret. When they were piled in front of him, however, Bisclavret paid no attention to them. The wise man who had earlier given advice to the king called out, "Lord, this is not the way to do it. Nothing would persuade the creature to get dressed in front of you or change his shape in public. You do not realize the importance of this. It is a matter of great indignity for him. Take him to your chamber and give him the clothes there. Let him in there for a time, and let us see if he changes into the shape of a man." The king himself proceeded to shut every door behind the wolf. After a while he returned, taking 2 companions with him. As all 3 entered the room, they found the nobleman fast asleep on the king's bed. Rushing toward him, the king embraced and kissed him many times. Shortly afterwards, he gave him back all his lands, bestowing on him more possessions than I can say. He also sent the woman into banishment, so that she was exiled from her country. The man who betrayed her husband with her also went into exile. She had many children afterwards who could always be instantly recognized, for it is the honest truth that many of the women in her family were born without noses and had to live their whole lives through with such an appearance. Wolfshead by Robert E. Howard, 1926. Fear. Your pardon, messieurs, but the meaning of fear you do not know. No, I hold to my statement. You are soldiers, adventurers. You have known the charges of regiments of dragoons, the frenzy of wind-lashed seas. But fear, real hair-raising, horror-crawling fear, you have not known. I myself have known such fear. But until the legions of darkness swirl from hell's gate and the world flames to ruin, will never such fear again be known to men. Hark, I will tell you the tale, for it was many years ago and half across the world, and none of you will ever see the man of whom I tell you, or seeing, know. Return, then, with me across the years to the day when I, a reckless young cavalier, stepped from the small boat that had landed me from the ship floating in the harbor, cursed the mud that littered the crude wharf, and strode up the landing toward the castle in answer to the invitation of an old friend, Dom Vincente d'Alusto. Dom Vincente was a strange, far-sighted man, one who saw visions beyond the ken of his time. In his veins, perhaps, ran the blood of those old Phoenicians who, the priests tell us, ruled the seas and built cities in far lands in the dim ages. His plan of fortune was strange and yet successful. Few men would have thought of it. Fewer could have succeeded. His estate was upon the western coast of Africa. There, by a small bay, he had cleared away the sullen jungle, built his castle and his storehouses, and with ruthless hand had he wrested the riches of the land. 4 ships he had, 3 smaller craft, and 1 great galleon. These plied between his domains and the cities of Spain, Portugal, France, and even England, laden with the 1,000 strange riches that Dom Vincente had gained by trade and by conquest. Look, messieurs, I draw a map on the table thus, with finger dipped in wine. Here lay the small, shallow harbor, and here the wide wharfs. A landing ran thus, up the slight slope with hut-like warehouses on each side, and here it stopped at a wide, shallow moat. Over it went a narrow drawbridge, and then one was confronted with a high palisade of logs set in the ground. This extended entirely around the castle. The castle itself was built on the model of another earlier age, being more for strength than beauty. Built of stone brought from a great distance, years of labor and 1,000 men toiling beneath the lash had reared its walls, and now, completely, it offered an almost impregnable appearance. Such was the intention of its builders, for Barbary pirates ranged the coasts, and the horror of an uprising lurked ever near. I found that I was not the only friend invited to the castle. It seems that once a year or some such matter, Dom Vincente brought a host of jolly companions to his lonely estate and made merry for some weeks, to make up for the work and solitude of the rest of the year. In fact, it was nearly night, and a great banquet was in progress when I entered. I was acclaimed with great delight, greeted boisterously by friends, and introduced to such strangers as were there. Entirely too weary to take part in much of the revelry, I ate, drank quietly, listened to the toasts and songs, and studied the feasters. Dom Vincente, of course, I knew, as I had been intimate with him for years. Also his pretty niece, Isabel, who was one reason I had accepted his invitation to come to that wilderness. Her second cousin, Carlos, I knew and disliked, a sly fellow with a face like a minx. Then there was my old friend, Luigi Varenza, an Italian, and his flirt of a sister, Marcita, making eyes at the men as usual. Then there was a short, stocky German who called himself Baron von Schuler, and John de Smart, an out-at-the-elbows nobleman of Gascony, and Don Florenzo de Seville, a lean, dark, silent man who called himself a Spaniard and wore a rapier nearly as long as himself. There were others, men and women, but it was long ago, and all their names and faces I do not remember. But there was one man whose face somehow drew my gaze as an alchemist magnet draws steel. He was a leanly built man of slightly more than medium height, dressed plainly, almost austerely, and he wore a sword almost as long as the Spaniards. But it was neither his clothes nor his sword which attracted my attention. It was his face, a refined, high-bred face. It was furrowed deep with lines that gave it a weary, haggard expression. Tiny scars flecked jaw and forehead as if torn by savage claws. I could have sworn the narrow gray eyes had a fleeting, haunted look in their expression at times. I leaned over to Marcita and asked the name of the man, as it had slipped my mind that we had been introduced. De Monture from Normandy, she answered. A strange man. I don't think I like him. Then he resists your snares, my little enchantress, I murmured. Long friendship making me as immune from her anger as from her wiles. But she chose not to be angry and answered coyly, glancing from under demurely lowered lashes. I watched de Monture much, feeling somehow a strange fascination. He ate lightly, drank much, seldom spoke, and then only to answer questions. Presently, toast making the rounds, I noticed his companions urging him to rise and give a health. At first he refused, then rose upon their repeated urgings and stood silent for a moment, goblet raised. He seemed to dominate, to overawe the group of revelers. Then, with a mocking, savage laugh, he lifted the goblet above his head. To Solomon, he exclaimed, who bound all devils, and thrice cursed be he for that some escaped. A toast and a curse in one. It was drunk silently, and with many sidelong, doubting glances. That night I retired early, weary of the long sea voyage and my head spinning from the strength of the wine, of which Don Vincente kept such great stores. My room was near the top of the castle, and looked out toward the forests of the south and the river. The room was furnished in crude splendor, as was all the rest of the castle. Going to the window, I gazed out at the arquebusier, pacing the castle grounds just inside the palisade, at the cleared space lying barren in the moonlight, at the forest beyond, at the silent river. In the dark shadows of the forest, some uncanny nightbird lifted a mocking voice. 1,000 minor notes sounded, birds and beasts, and the devil knows what else. Some great jungle cat began a hair-lifting yowling. I shrugged my shoulders and turned from the windows. Surely devils lurked in those somber depths. There came a knock at my door, and I opened it, to admit de Monture. He strode to the window and gazed at the moon, which rose resplendent and glorious. The moon is almost full, is it not, monsieur? He remarked, turning to me. I nodded, and I could have sworn that he shuddered. Your pardon, monsieur. I will not annoy you further. He turned to go, but at the door retraced his steps. Monsieur, he almost whispered, with a fierce intensity, whatever you do, be sure you bar and bolt your door tonight." Then he was gone, leaving me to stare after him bewilderedly. I dozed off to sleep, the distant shouts of the revelers in my ears, and though I was weary, or perhaps because of it, I slept lightly. While I never really awoke until morning, sounds and noises seemed to drift to me through my veil of slumber, and once it seemed that something was prying and shoving against the bolted door. As is to be supposed, most of the guests were in a beastly humor the following day, and remained in their rooms most of the morning, or else straggled down late. Besides Don Vincente, there were really only 3 of the masculine members sober: de Monture, the Spaniard de Seville, as he called himself, and myself. The Spaniard never touched wine, and though de Monture consumed incredible quantities of it, it never affected him in any way. The ladies greeted us most graciously. "'Struth, signor," remarked Marcita, giving me her hand with a gracious air that was like to make me snicker. "I am glad to see there are gentlemen among us who care more for our company than for the wine cup, for most of them are most surprisingly befuddled this morning." Then, with a most outrageous turning of her wondrous eyes, "Methinks someone was too drunk to be discreet last night, or not drunk enough, for unless my poor senses deceived me much, someone came fumbling at my door late in the night." "Ha!" I exclaimed in quick anger. "No, hush." She glanced about as if to see that we were alone. Then, "Is it not strange that Signor de Monture, before he retired last night, instructed me to fasten my door firmly?" "Strange," I murmured, but did not tell her that he had told me the same thing. "And is it not strange, Pierre, that though Signor de Monture left the banquet hall even before you did, yet he has the appearance of one who has been up all night? Tonight," she said roguishly, "I will leave my door unbolted and see whom I catch." "You will do no such thing." She showed her teeth in a contemptuous smile and displayed a small, wicked dagger. "Listen, imp. De Monture gave me the same warning he did you. Whatever he knew, whoever prowled the halls last night, the object was more apt murder than amorous adventure. Keep your doors bolted. The Lady Isabel shares your room, does she not?" "Not she. And I send my woman to the servants' quarters at night," she murmured, gazing mischievously at me from beneath drooping eyelids. "One would think you a woman of no character from your talk," I told her, with the frankness of youth and of long friendship. "Walk with care, young lady," I said, as I walked away to pay my respects to Isabel. A band of armed villagers had started thronging around the gates, kept at a distance by the Portuguese soldiers. Presently, Don Vincente came to us and said, "One of the woodcutters from the village was torn to pieces by a leopard or some such beast last night. A strong young man and unmarried." "A leopard? Did they see it?" suddenly asked de Monture. And when Don Vincente said no, that it came and went in the night, de Monture lifted a trembling hand and drew it across his forehead, as if to brush away cold sweat. It was that evening that a brooding animosity, hardly apparent, between Baron von Schuler and John de Smart broke out into a flame. Marcita had carried on a most outrageous flirtation with both of them. That was not wise. De Smart was a wild young fool. Von Schuler was a lustful beast. Their hair flamed to a murderous fury when the Germans sought to kiss Marcita. Swords were clashing in an instant, but before Don Vincente could thunder a command to halt, Luigi was between the combatants and had beaten their swords down, hurling them back viciously. "Signori," he said softly, but with a fierce intensity, "is it the part of high-bred signori to fight over my sister? Ha! By the toenails of Satan, for the toss of a coin I would call you both out. You, Marcita, Go to your chamber instantly, nor leave until I give you permission." And she went, for, independent though she was, none cared to face the youth when a tigerish snarl curled his lips, a murderous gleam lightened his dark eyes. Apologies were made, but from the glances the two rivals threw at each other, we knew that the quarrel was not forgotten, and would blaze forth again at the slightest pretext. Late that night, I woke suddenly with a strange, eerie feeling of horror. Why, I could not say. Just as I got up, hastily rubbing my eyes, the silence was broken by a wild scream. A scream that rang through the castle and brought a startled shout from the arquebusier pacing the palisade. A scream from the mouth of a girl frenzied with terror. I jerked the door open and raced down the dark corridor. Dashing down a winding stair, I careened into someone at the bottom, and we tumbled headlong. He rasped something, and I recognized the voice of John de Smart. I hauled him to his feet and raced along, he following. The screams had ceased, but the whole castle was in an uproar, voices shouting, the clank of weapons, lights flashing up. Don Vincente's voice shouting for the soldiers, the noise of armed men rushing through the rooms and falling over each other. With all the confusion, de Smart, the Spaniard, and I reached Marcita's room just as Luigi darted inside and snatched his sister into his arms. Others rushed in, carrying lights and weapons, shouting, demanding to know what was occurring. The girl lay quietly in her brother's arms, her dark hair loose and rippling over her shoulders, her night garments torn to shreds. Long scratches showed upon her arms and shoulders. Presently, she opened her eyes, shuddered, then shrieked wildly, and clung frantically to Luigi, begging him not to let something take her. "The door," she whimpered. "I left it unbarred, and something crept into my room through the darkness. I struck at it with my dagger, and it hurled me to the floor, tearing at me. Then I fainted." "Where is von Schuler?" asked the Spaniard, a fierce glint in his dark eyes. Every man glanced at his neighbor. All the guests were there except the German. I noted de Monteur gazing at the terrified girl, his face more haggard than usual, and I thought it strange that he wore no weapon. "I, von Schuler!" exclaimed de Smart fiercely, and half of us followed Don Vincente out into the corridor. We began a vengeful search through the castle, and in a small, dark hallway we found von Schuler. On his face he lay, in a crimson, ever-widening stain. This is the work of some villager," exclaimed de Smart, face aghast. "Nonsense," bellowed Don Vincente. "No one from outside could pass the soldiers. All servants were barred and bolted in their quarters." "But who else could have done this deed?" exclaimed de Smart in a fury. "You," I said abruptly. "Else, why ran you so swiftly away from the room of Marcita?" "Curse you, you lie!" he shouted, and his swift-drawn sword leaped from my breast. But quick as he was, the Spaniard was quicker. De Smart's rapier clattered against the wall, and de Smart stood like a statue, the Spaniard's motionless point just touching his throat. "Bind him," said the Spaniard without passion. "Put down your blade, Don Florenzo," commanded Don Vincente, striding forward and dominating the scene. "Senor de Smart, you are one of my best friends, but I am the only law here, and duty must be done. Give your word that you will not seek to escape." "I give it," replied the Gascon calmly. "I acted hastily. I apologize. I was not intentionally running away, but the halls and the corridors of this cursed castle confuse me." Of us all, probably but one man believed him. "Messieurs," de Monteur stepped forward, "this youth is not guilty. Turn the German over." 2 soldiers did as he asked. De Monteur shuddered, pointing. The rest of us glanced once, then recoiled in horror. Could man have done that thing? With a dagger, began someone. No dagger makes wounds like that, said the Spaniard. The German was torn to pieces by the talons of some frightful beast. We glanced around us, half expecting some hideous monster to leap upon us from the shadows. We searched that castle, every foot, every inch of it, and we found no trace of any beast. Dawn was breaking when I returned to my room. I had heard vague tales, little more than hints of legends, of the devilish leopard cult that existed on the west coast. Dom Vincente had told us tales of beast men, disguised in skins of leopards, who stole through the midnight jungle and slew and devoured. Always the footprints of a man led away from the scene of the murder. The footprints were of a man who wore shoes. A ghastly thrill of unexplainable horror traveled up and down my spine. Who, then, did the villagers believe was doing these frightful murders? Who slew the German and attacked Marcita? Why did de Monteur warn us and then appear to have knowledge of the crime, telling us that Desmart was innocent and then proving it? It was all beyond me. The tale of the slaughter got among the villagers in spite of all we could do, and they appeared restless and nervous. A brooding atmosphere pervaded the castle. The women kept their chambers that day. The men were restless and moody. Dom Vincente announced that the sentries would be doubled and some would patrol the corridors of the castle itself. I found myself musing cynically that if my suspicions were true, sentries would be of little good. I am not, messieurs, a man to brook such a situation with patience, and I was young then. So as we drank before retiring, I flung my goblet on the table and angrily announced that in spite of man, beast, or devil, I would sleep that night with doors flung wide, and I tramped angrily to my chamber. Again, as on the first night, de Monteur came, and his face was as a man who had looked into the gaping gates of hell. "I have come," he said, "to ask you, nay, monsieur, to implore you, to reconsider your rash determination." I shook my head impatiently. "You are resolved? Yes? Then I ask you to do this for me, that after I enter my chamber, you will bolt my doors from the outside." I did as he asked, and then made my way back to my chamber, my mind in a maze of wonderment. I laid rapier and dagger close at hand. I did not go to bed, but crouched in a great chair in the darkness. Then I had much ado to keep from sleeping. To keep myself awake, I fell to musing on the strange words of de Monteur. He seemed to be laboring under great excitement. His eyes hinted of ghastly mysteries known to him alone. And yet his face was not that of a wicked man. Suddenly, the notion took me to go to his chamber and talk with him. Walking those dark passages was a shuddersome task, but eventually I stood before de Monteur's door. I called softly. Silence. I reached out a hand and felt splintered fragments of wood. Hastily, I struck flint and steel, which I carried, and the flaming tinder showed the great oaken door sagging on its mighty hinges, showed a door smashed and splintered from the inside, and the chamber of de Monteur was unoccupied. Some instinct prompted me to hurry back to my room, swiftly but silently, shoeless feet treading softly. And as I neared the door, I was aware of something in the darkness before me, something which crept in from a side corridor and glided stealthily along. In a wild panic of fear, I leaped, striking wildly and aimlessly in the darkness. All that my clenched fist encountered was a human head, and something went down with a crash. Again, I struck a light. A man lay senseless on the floor. and he was de Monture. I thrust a candle into a niche in the wall, and just then de Monture's eyes opened, and he rose uncertainly. "You!" I exclaimed, hardly knowing what I said. "You, of all men!" He merely nodded. "You killed von Schuler." "Yes." I recoiled with a gasp of horror. "Listen." He raised his hand. "Take your rapier and run me through. No man will touch you." "No," I exclaimed, "I cannot." "Then quick," he said hurriedly. "Get into your chamber and bolt the door. Haste, it will return." "What will return?" I asked, with a thrill of horror. "If it will harm me, it will harm you. Come into the chamber with me." "No, no," he fairly shrieked, springing back from my outstretched arm. "Haste, haste, it left me for an instant, but it will return." Then, in a low-pitched voice of indescribable horror, "It is returning. It is returning. It is here now." And I felt a something, a formless, shapeless presence near, a thing of frightfulness. De Monture was standing, legs braced, arms thrown back, fists clenched. The muscles bulged beneath his skin, his eyes widened and narrowed. The veins stood out upon his forehead as if in great physical effort. As I looked, to my horror, out of nothing, a shapeless, nameless something took vague form. Like a shadow, it moved upon de Monture. It was hovering about him. Good God, it was merging, becoming one with the man. De Monture swayed. A great gasp escaped him. The dim thing vanished. De Monture wavered. Then he turned toward me, and may God grant that I never look on a face like that again. It was a hideous, a bestial face. The eyes gleamed with a frightful ferocity. The snarling lips were drawn back from gleaming teeth, which to my startled gaze appeared more like bestial fangs than human teeth. Silently, the thing, I cannot call it a human, slunk toward me. Gasping with horror, I sprang back and through the door, just as the thing launched itself through the air with a sinuous motion which even then made me think of a leaping wolf. I slammed the door, holding it against the frightful thing, which hurled itself again and again against it. Finally, it desisted, and I heard it slink stealthily off down the corridor. Faint and exhausted, I sat down, waiting, listening. Through the open window wafted the breeze, bearing all the scents of Africa, the spicy and the foul. From the village came the sound of a drum. Other drums answered farther up the river and back in the bush. Then, from somewhere in the jungle, horridly incongruous, sounded the long, high-pitched call of a timber wolf. My soul revolted. Dawn brought a tale of terrified villagers, of a woman torn by some fiend of the night, barely escaping. And to de Monture I went. On the way I met Don Vincente. He was perplexed and angry. "Some hellish thing is at work in this castle," he said. "Last night, though I have said naught of it to anyone, something leaped upon the back of one of the arquebusiers, tore the leather jerkin from his shoulders, and pursued him to the barbican. More, somebody locked de Monture into his room last night, and he was forced to smash the door to get out." He strode on, muttering to himself, and I proceeded down the stairs, more puzzled than ever. De Monture sat upon a stool, gazing out the window. An indescribable air of weariness was about him. His long hair was uncombed and tousled. His garments were tattered. With a shudder, I saw faint crimson stains upon his hands, and noted that the nails were torn and broken. He looked up as I came in and waved me to a seat. His face was worn and haggard, but was that of a man. After a moment's silence, he spoke. "I will tell you my strange tale. Never before has it passed my lips, and why I tell you, knowing that you will not believe me, I cannot say." And then I listened to what was surely the wildest, the most fantastic, the weirdest tale ever heard by man. "Years ago," said de Monture, "I was upon a military mission in northern France. Alone, I was forced to pass through the fiend-haunted woodlands of Villefort. In those frightful forests, I was beset by an inhuman, a ghastly thing, a werewolf. Beneath a midnight moon we fought and slew it. Now this is the truth, that if a werewolf is slain in the half-form of a man, its ghost will haunt its slayer through eternity. But if it is slain as a wolf, hell gapes to receive it. The true werewolf is not, as many think, a man who may take the form of a wolf, but a wolf who takes the form of a man. Now listen, my friend, and I will tell you of the wisdom, the hellish knowledge that is mine, gained through many a frightful deed, imparted to me amid the ghastly shadows of midnight forests where fiends and half-beasts roamed. In the beginning, the world was strange, misshapen. Grotesque beasts wandered through its jungles. Driven from another world, ancient demons and fiends came in great numbers and settled upon this newer, younger world. Long the forces of good and evil warred. A strange beast, known as man, wandered among the other beasts. And since good or bad must have a concrete form ere either accomplishes its desire, the spirits of good entered man. The fiends entered other beasts, reptiles and birds, and long and fiercely waged the age-old battle. But men conquered. The great dragons and serpents were slain, and with them the demons. Finally, Solomon, wise beyond the ken of man, made great war upon them, and by virtue of his wisdom slew, seized, and bound. But there were some which were the fiercest, the boldest, and though Solomon drove them out, he could not conquer them. Those had taken the form of wolves. As the ages passed, wolf and demon became merged. No longer could the fiend leave the body of the wolf at will. In many instances, the savagery of the wolf overcame the subtlety of the demon and enslaved him, so the wolf became again only a beast, a fierce, cunning beast, but merely a beast. But of the werewolves, there are many, even yet. And during the time of the full moon, the wolf may take the form, or the half-form, of a man. When the moon hovers at her zenith, however, the wolf's spirit again takes ascendancy, and the werewolf becomes a true wolf once more. But if it is slain in the form of a man, then the spirit is free to haunt its slayer through the ages. Hearken now. I had thought to have slain the thing after it had changed to its true shape, but I slew it an instant too soon. The moon, though it approached the zenith, had not yet reached it, nor had the thing taken on fully the wolf form. Of this I knew nothing, and went my way. But when the neat time approached for the full moon, I began to be aware of a strange, malicious influence. An atmosphere of horror hovered in the air, and I was aware of inexplicable, uncanny impulses. One night, in a small village in the center of a great forest, the influence came upon me with full power. It was night, and the moon, nearly full, was rising over the forest. And between the moon and me, I saw, floating in the upper air, ghostly and barely discernible, the outline of a wolf's head. I remember little of what happened thereafter. I remember dimly clambering into the silent street, remember struggling, resisting briefly, vainly, and the rest is a crimson maze, until I came to myself the next morning and found my garments and hands caked and stained crimson, and heard the horrified chattering of the villagers, telling of a pair of clandestine lovers slaughtered in a ghastly manner, scarcely outside the village, torn to pieces as if by wild beasts, as if by wolves. From that village I fled aghast, but I fled not alone. In the day I could not feel the drive of my fearful captor, but when night fell and the moon rose, I ranged the silent forest, a frightful thing, a slayer of humans, a fiend in a man's body. God, the battles I have fought! But always it overcame me and drove me ravening after some new victim. But after the moon had passed its fullness, the thing's power over me ceased suddenly, nor did it return until 3 nights before the moon was full again. Since then, I have roamed the world, fleeing, seeking to escape. Always the thing follows, taking possession of my body when the moon is full. Gods, the frightful deeds I have done! I would have slain myself long ago, but I dare not, for my soul would be forever hunted through the flames of hell. And hearken, most frightful of all, my slain body would forever roam the earth, moved and inhabited by the soul of the werewolf. Can any thought be more ghastly? And I seem immune to the weapons of men. Swords have pierced me, daggers have hacked me, I am covered with scars, yet never have they struck me down. In Germany they bound and led me to the block. There would I have willingly placed my head, but the thing came upon me, and breaking my bonds I slew and fled. Up and down the world I have wandered, leaving horror and slaughter in my trail. Chains, cells cannot hold me. The thing is fastened to me through all eternity. In desperation I accepted Don Vincente's invitation, for look you, none knows of my frightful double life, since no one could recognize me in the clutch of the demon, and few, seeing me, lived to tell of it. My hands are red, my soul doomed to everlasting flames, my mind is torn with remorse for my crimes, and yet I can do nothing to help myself. Surely, Pierre, no man has ever known the hell that I have known. Yes, I slew von Schuler, and I sought to destroy the girl Marcita. Why I did not, I cannot say, for I have slain both women and men. Now, if you will, take your sword and slay me, and with my last breath I will give you the good God's blessing. You know now my tale, and you see before you a man, fiend-haunted for all eternity. My mind was spinning with wonderment as I left the room of de Monteur. What to do, I knew not. It seemed likely that he would yet murder all of us, and yet I could not bring myself to tell Don Vincente all. From the bottom of my soul I pitied de Monteur, so I kept my peace, and in the days that followed I made occasion to seek him out and converse with him. A real friendship sprang up between us. So the days passed in feasting, drinking, and hunting, until one night de Monteur came to my chamber and pointed silently at the moon which was just rising. "Look ye," he said, "I have a plan. I will give it out that I am going into the jungle for hunting and will go forth, apparently for several days. But at night I will return to the castle, and you must lock me into the dungeon which is used as a storeroom." This we did, and I managed to slip down twice a day and carry food and drink to my friend. He insisted on remaining in the dungeon even in the day, for though the fiend had never exerted its influence over him in the daytime, and he believed it powerless then, yet he would take no chances. It was during this time that I began to notice that Don Vincente's mink-faced cousin, Carlos, was forcing his attentions upon Isabel, and she seemed to resent those attentions. Myself, I would have challenged him to a duel for the toss of a coin, for I despised him, but it was really none of my affair. However, it seemed that Isabel feared him. My friend Luigi had also become enamored of the dainty Portuguese girl and was making swift love to her daily. And de Monture sat in his cell and reviewed his ghastly deeds until he battered the bars with his bare hands. And Don Florenzo wandered about the castle grounds like a dour Mephistopheles, and the other guests rode and quarreled and drank. Each day the villagers grew more and more sullen and intractable. One night, not long before the full of the moon, I entered the dungeon where de Monture sat. He looked up quickly. "You dare much, coming to me in the night." I shrugged my shoulders, seating myself. A small barred window let in the night scents and sounds of Africa. "Hark to the beating of the drums," I said. "For the past week they have sounded almost incessantly." De Monture assented. So we talked, when suddenly de Monture became silent and moody, answering only in monosyllables. The moon rose and peered in at the barred windows. De Monture's face was illumined by its beams. And then the hand of horror grasped me. On the wall behind de Monture appeared a shadow clearly defined of a wolf's head. At the same instant, de Monture felt its influence. With a shriek, he bounded from his stool. He pointed fiercely, and as with trembling hands I slammed and bolted the door behind me, I felt him hurl his weight against it. As I fled up the stairway, I heard a wild raving and battering at the iron-bound door. But with all the werewolf's might, the great door held. Just as I entered my room, a servant dashed in and gasped out a tale he had been keeping for days. I listened incredulously, and then went forth to find Don Vincente. I was told that Carlos had asked him to accompany him to the village. My informer was Don Florenzo of Seville, and when I gave him a brief outline of the servant's tale, he accompanied me. Together, we dashed through the castle gate, flinging a word to the guards, and down the landing toward the village. Don Vincente, walk with care, keep sword loosened in its sheath. Fool to walk in the night with Carlos, the traitor. They were nearing the village when we caught up with them. "Don Vincente," I exclaimed, "return instantly to the castle. Carlos has told me that he lusts for your wealth and for Isabel." A terrified man babbled to him of booted footprints near the places where the woodcutters were murdered, and Carlos has made the villagers believe that the slayer was you. Tonight they are to rise and slay every man in the castle except Carlos. Do you not believe me, Don Vincente?" "Is this the truth, Carlos?" asked Don Vincente in amazement. Carlos laughed mockingly. "The fool speaks truth," he said, "but it accomplishes you nothing." "Ho!" he shouted as he leaped for Don Vincente. Steel flashed in the moonlight, and the Spaniard's sword was through Carlos ere he could move, and the shadows rose about us. Then it was back to back, sword and dagger, 3 men against 100, and raging screams went up from vengeful throats. An instant later, Don Vincente fell upon me, with a spear in one arm and another through the leg. Don Florenzo was standing above us, sword leaping like a live thing, when a charge of the arquebusiers swept the riverbank clear, and we were borne into the castle. The hordes came with a rush, spears flashing like a wave of steel, a thunderous roar of voices going up to the skies. Time and again they swept up the slopes, bounding the moat until they were swarming over the palisades. And time and again the fire of the 100-odd defenders hurled them back. They had set fire to the warehouses, and their light vied with the light of the moon. Just across the river there was a larger storehouse, and about this hordes of the villagers gathered, tearing it apart for plunder. Would that they would drop a torch upon it, said Don Vincente, for naught is stored therein save some 1,000 pounds of gunpowder. I dared not store the treacherous stuff this side of the river. All the men of the river and coast have gathered for our slaughter, and all my ships are upon the seas. We may hold out a while, but eventually they will swarm the palisade and put us to the slaughter. I hastened to the dungeon wherein de Monteur sat. Outside the door I called to him, and he bade me enter in voice which told me the fiend had left him for an instant. The villagers have risen, I told him. I guessed as much. How goes the battle? I gave him the details of the betrayal and the fight, and mentioned the powder house across the river. He sprang to his feet. Now, by my hag-ridden soul, he exclaimed, I will fling the dice once more with hell. Swift, let me out of the castle. I will essay to swim the river and set off yon powder. It is insanity, I exclaimed. 1,000 men lurk between the palisades and the river, and thrice that number beyond. The river itself swarms with crocodiles. I will attempt it, he answered, a great light in his face. If I can reach it, some 1,000 villagers will lighten the siege. If I am slain, then my soul is free, and mayhap will gain some forgiveness for that I gave my life to atone for my crimes. Then, haste, he exclaimed, for the demon is returning. Already I feel his influence. Haste ye! For the castle gates we sped, and as de Monteur ran, he gasped as a man in a terrific battle. At the gate he pitched headlong, then rose to spring through it. Frenzied yells greeted him from the darkness. The arquebusiers shouted curses at him and at me. Peering down from the top of the palisades, I saw him turn from side to side uncertainly. A score of men were rushing recklessly forward, spears raised. Then the eerie wolf yell rose to the skies, and de Monteur bounded forward. Aghast, the men paused, and before any of them could move, he was among them. Wild shrieks, not of rage, but of terror. In amazement, the arquebusiers held their fire. Straight through the onslaught, de Monteur charged, and when they broke and fled, 3 of them fled not. A dozen steps de Monteur took in pursuit, and then stopped stock still. A moment he stood so, while spears flew about him, then turned and ran swiftly in the direction of the river. A few steps from the river, another band of villagers barred his way. In the famine's light of the burning houses, the scene was clearly illuminated. A thrown spear tore through de Monteur's shoulder. Without pausing in his stride, he tore it forth and drove it through his attacker, leaping over his body to get among the others. With shrieks they fled, and de Monteur, bounding upon the back of one, brought him down. Then he rose, staggered, and sprang to the river bank. An instant he paused there, and then vanished in the shadows. Name of the devil! Gasped Don Vincente at my shoulder. What manner of man is that? Was that de Monteur? I nodded. The enraged yells of the villagers rose above the crackle of the arquebus fire. They were massed thick around the great warehouse across the river. They plan a great rush, said Don Vincente. They will swarm clear over the palisade, methinks. Ha! A crash that seemed to rip the skies apart. A burst of flame that mounted to the stars. The castle rocked with the explosion. Then silence, as the smoke, drifting away, showed only a great crater where the warehouse had stood. I could tell of how Don Vincente led a charge, crippled as he was, out of the castle gate and down the slope, to fall upon the terrified men who had escaped the explosion. I could tell, too, messieurs, of how I became separated from the band, and of how I wandered far into the jungle, unable to find my way back to the coast. I could tell how I was captured by a wandering band of raiders, and of how I escaped. But such is not my intention. In itself, it would make a long tale, and it is of de Monture that I am speaking. I thought much of the things that had passed, and wondered if indeed de Monture reached the storehouse to blow it to the skies, or whether it was but the deed of chance. That a man could swim that reptile-swarming river, fiend-driven though he was, seemed impossible. And if he blew up the storehouse, he must have gone up with it. So one night, I pushed my way wearily through the jungle and sighted the coast, and close to the shore a small tumble-down hut of thatch. To it I went, thinking to sleep therein if insects and reptiles would allow. I entered the doorway and then stopped short. Upon a makeshift stool sat a man. He looked up as I entered, and the rays of the moon fell across his face. I started back with a ghastly thrill of horror. It was de Monture, and the moon was full. Then, as I stood, unable to flee, he rose and came toward me, and his face, though haggard as of a man who had looked into hell, was the face of a sane man. "Come in, my friend," he said, and there was great peace in his voice. "Come in and fear me not. The fiend has left me forever." "But tell me, how conquered you?" I exclaimed as I grasped his hand. "I fought a frightful battle as I ran to the river," he answered, "for the fiend had me in its grasp and drove me to fall upon the attacking men. But for the first time, my soul and mind gained ascendancy for an instant just long enough to hold me to my purpose. And I believe the good saints came to my aid, for I was giving my life to save life. I leaped into the river and swam, and in an instant the crocodiles were swarming about me. Again, in the clutch of the fiend, I fought them there in the river. Then, suddenly, the thing left me. I climbed from the river and fired the warehouse. The explosion hurled me hundreds of feet, and for days I wandered witless through the jungle. But the full moon came, and came again, and I felt not the influence of the fiend. I am free, free. And a wondrous note of exultation thrilled his words. My soul is free. Incredible as it seems, the demon lies drowned upon the bed of the river, or else inhabits the body of one of the savage reptiles that swim the ways of the Niger. I had been at the new Briar Cliff Sanitarium nearly 3 weeks before I actually saw the house. Every morning as I lay abed after the nurse had taken my temperature, I wondered what was beyond the copse of fir and spruce at the turn of the road. The picture seemed incomplete without chimneys rising among the evergreens. I thought about it so much, I finally convinced myself that there really was a house in the wood, a house where people lived and worked and were happy. All during the long, trying days when I was learning to navigate a wheelchair, I used to picture the house and the people who lived in it. There would be a father, I was sure, a stout, good-natured father, somewhat bald, who sat on the porch and smoked a cob pipe in the evening. And there was a mother, too, a waistless, plaid-skirted mother, with hair smoothly parted over her forehead, who sat beside the father as he rocked and smoked, and who had a brown work-basket in her lap.
She spread the stocking feet over her outstretched fingers, and her vigilant needle spied out and closed every hole with a cunning no mechanical loom could rival. Then there was the daughter. I was a little hazy in my conception of her, but I knew she was tall and slender as a hazel wand, and that her eyes were blue and wide and sympathetic. Picturing the house and its people became a favorite pastime with me during the time I was acquiring the art of walking all over again. By the time I was able to trust my legs on the road, I felt I knew my way to my vision friend's home as well as I knew the byways of my own parish, though I had, as yet, not set foot outside the sanitarium. Oddly enough, I chose the evening for my first long stroll. It was unusually warm for September in Maine, and some of the sturdier of the convalescents had been playing tennis during the afternoon. After dinner, they sat on the veranda, comparing notes on their respective cases of influenza, or matching experiences in appendicitis operations. After building the house bit by bit from my imagination, as a child pieces together a picture puzzle, I should have been bitterly disappointed if the woods had proved empty. Yet, when I reached the turn of the road and found my dream house a reality, I was almost afraid. Bit for bit and part for part, it was as I had visualized it. A long, rambling, comfortable-looking farmhouse it was, with a wide porch screened by vines, and a whitewashed picket fence about the little clearing before it. There was a tumble-down gate in the fence, one of the kind that is held shut with a weighted chain. Looking closely, I saw the weight was a disused plowshare. Leading from gate to porch was a path of flat stones, laid unevenly in the short grass, and bordered with a double row of clamshells. A lamp burned in the front room, sending out cheerful golden rays to meet the silver moonlight. A strange, eerie sensation came over me as I stood there. Somehow, I felt I had seen that part of the house before, many, many times before, yet I had never been in that part of Maine till I came to Briarcliff, nor had anyone ever described the place to me. Indeed, except for my idle dreams, I had had no intimation that there was a house in those pines at all. "Who lives in the house at the turn of the road?" I asked the fat man who roomed next to me. He looked at me as blankly as if I had addressed him in a foreign tongue, then countered, "What road?" "Why, the South Road," I explained. "I mean, the house in the pines, just beyond the curve, you know." If such a thing had not been obviously absurd, I should have thought he looked frightened at my answer. Certainly his already prominent eyes started a bit further from his face. "Nobody lives there," he assured me. "Nobody's lived there for years. There isn't any house there." I became angry. What right had this fellow to make my civil question the occasion for an ill-timed jest? "As you please," I replied. "Perhaps there isn't any house there for you, but I saw one there last night." "My God!" he ejaculated, and hurried away as if I'd just told him I was infected with smallpox. Later in the day, I overheard a snatch of conversation between him and one of his acquaintances in the lounge. "I tell you, it's so," he was saying with great earnestness. "I thought it was all a lot of poppycock myself, but that clergyman saw it last night. I'm going to pack my traps and get back to the city, and not waste any time about it either." "Rats," his companion scoffed. "He must have been stringing you." Turning to light a cigar, he caught sight of me. "Say, Mr. Weatherby," he called, "you didn't mean to tell my friend here that you really saw a house down by those pines last night, did you?" "I certainly did," I answered, "and I tell you, too.
There's nothing unusual about it, is there? Is there, he repeated. Is there? Say, what did it look like? I described to him as well as I could, and his eyes grew as wide as those of a child hearing a story of Bluebeard. See here, I demanded. What's all the mystery about that farmhouse? Why shouldn't I see it? It's there to be seen, isn't it? He gulped once or twice, as if there was something hot in his mouth, before he answered. Look here, Mr. Weatherby, I'm telling you this for your own good. You'd better stay in on nights, and you'd better stay away from those pines in particular. Nonplussed at this unsolicited advice, I was about to ask an explanation when I detected the aftertang of whiskey on his breath. I understood then. I was being made the butt of a drunken joke. I'm very much obliged, I'm sure, I replied with dignity, but if you don't mind, I'll choose my own comings and goings. Oh, go as far as you like. He waved his arms wide in token of my complete free agency. Go as far as you like. I'm going to New York. And he did. The pair of them left the sanitarium that afternoon. A slight recurrence of my illness held me housebound for several days after my conversation with the two sportively inclined gentlemen, and the next time I ventured out at night the moon had waxed to the full, pouring a flood of light upon the earth that rivaled midday. The minutest objects were as readily distinguished as they would have been before sunset. In fact, I remember comparing the evening to a silver-plated noon. As I trudged along the road to the pine copse, I was busy formulating plans for intruding into the family circle at the farmhouse, devising all manner of pious frauds by which to scrape acquaintance. Shall I feign having lost my way and inquire direction to the sanitarium, or shall I ask if some mythical acquaintance, a John Squires, for instance, lives there? I asked myself as I neared the turn of the road. Fortunately for my conscience, all these subterfuges were unnecessary, for as I neared the whitewashed fence, a girl left the porch and walked quickly to the gate, where she stood gazing pensively along the moonlit road. It was almost as if she were coming to meet me, I thought, as I slackened my pace and assumed an air of deliberate casualness. Almost abreast of her, I lowered my cadence still more and looked directly at her. Then I knew why my conception of the girl who lived in that house had been misty and indistinct. From the smoothly parted hair above her wide eyes to the hem of her white cotton frock, she was as beautiful as a Rossetti saint, as wonderful to the eye as a medieval poet's vision of his lost love in paradise. Her forehead, evenly framed in the beaten bronze of her hair, was wide and high, and startlingly white, and her brows were delicately penciled, as if laid on by an artist with a camel's hair brush. Her eyes were sweet and clear as forest pools mirroring the September sky, and lifted a little at the corners, giving her face a quaint but distinct look in the midst of these Maine woods. One of her hands rested lightly on the gate, as finely cut as a bit of Italian sculpture, and scarcely less white than the limed wood supporting it. I noticed idly that her forefinger was somewhat longer than the others, and that the nails were almond-shaped and very pink, almost red, as if they had been rouged and brightly polished. She looked at me as calm and unperturbed as though I had been non-existent. One might have thought I was an invisible wraith of the night. Mechanically, I raised my cap, and wholly without conscious volition, I heard my own voice asking, "May I trouble you for a drink from your well? I'm from the sanitarium, only a few days out of bed, in fact, and I fear I've overdone myself in my walk." A smile flitted across her wide lips, quick and sympathetic as a mother's response to her child's request, as she swung the gate open for me. "Surely," she answered, and her voice had all the sweetness of the south wind blowing through her native pines. "Surely you may drink at our well, and rest yourself too, if you wish." She preceded me up the path, quickening her pace as she neared the house, and running nimbly up the steps to the porch. From where I stood beside the old-fashioned well, fitted with windlass and bucket, I could hear the sound of whispering voices in earnest conversation. Hers I recognized, lowered though it was, by the flute-like purling of its tones. The other two were deeper and, it seemed to me, hoarse and throaty. Somehow, odd as it seemed, there was a queer, canine note in them, dimly reminding me of the muttering of not too friendly dogs. Such fractious growls as I had heard while doing missionary duty in Alaska, when the half-wolf malamutes were not fed promptly at the relay stations. Her voice rose a thought higher, as if in argument, and I fancied I heard her whisper, "This one is mine. I tell you, mine. I'll brook no interference. Go to your own hunting." An instant more, and there was a reluctant, assenting growl from the shadow of the vines curtaining the porch, and a light laugh from the girl as she descended the steps, swinging a bright tin cup in her hand. For a second she looked at me as she sent the bucket plunging into the stone-curbed well. Then she announced, in explanation, "We're great hunters here, you know. The season is just in, and Dad and I have the worst quarrels about whose game is whose." The well was very deep, and my breath was coming fast by the time I had helped her wind the bucket rope upon the windlass. But the water was cold, as only spring-fed well water can be. As she poured it from the bucket, it shone almost like foam in the moonlight, and seemed to whisper with a half-human voice instead of gurgling as other water does when poured. I had drunk water in nearly every quarter of the globe, but never such water as that. Cold as the breath from a glacier, limpid as visualized air, it was yet so light and tasteless in substance that only the chill in my throat and the sight of the liquid in the cup told me I was doing more than going through the motions of drinking. "And now, will you rest?" she invited, as I finished my third draught. "We've an extra chair on the porch for you." Behind the screen of vines, I found her father and mother seated in the rays of the big kitchen lamp. They were just as I had expected to find them, plain, homely, sincere country folk, courteous in their reception and anxious to make a sick stranger welcome. Both were stout, with the comfortable stoutness of middle age and good health, but both had surprisingly slender hands. I noticed, too, the same characteristic of an overlong forefinger was apparent in their hands as in their daughters', and that the nails of both were trimmed to points and stained almost a brilliant red. "My father, Mr. Squires," the girl introduced, "and my mother, Mrs. Squires." I could not repress a start. These people bore the very name I had casually thought to use when inquiring for some imaginary person. Luck had surely guided me away from that attempt to scrape an acquaintance. What a figure I should have cut if I had actually asked for Mr. Squires. Though I was not aware of it, my curious glance must have stayed longer on their reddened nails than I had intended, for Mrs. Squires looked deprecatingly at her hands. "We've all been turning in, putting up fox grapes." She included her husband and daughter with a comprehensive gesture. "And the stain just won't wash out. Has to wear off, you know." I spent, perhaps, 2 hours with my newfound friends, talking of everything from the best methods of potato culture to the surest way of landing a 9-pound bass. All three joined in the conversation and took a lively interest in the topics under discussion. After the vapid talk of the guests at the sanitarium, I found the simple, interested discourse of these country people as stimulating as wine, and when I left them, it was with a hearty promise to renew my call at an early date. "Better wait until after dark," Mr. Squires warned. "We'd be glad to see you any time, but we're so busy these fall days, we haven't much time for company." I took the broad hint in the same friendly spirit it was given. It must have grown chillier than I realized while I sat there, for my new friend's hands were clay cold when I took them in mine at parting. Homeward bound, a whimsical thought struck me so suddenly I laughed aloud. There was something suggestive of the dog tribe about the Squires family, though I could not for the life of me say what it was. Even Mildred, the daughter, beautiful as she was, with her light eyes, her prominent nose, and her wide mouth, reminded me in some vague way of a silver collie I had owned as a boy. I struck a tassel of dried leaves from a cluster of weeds with my walking stick as I smiled at the fanciful conceit. The legend of the werewolves, those horrible monsters formed as men, but capable of assuming bestial shape at will and killing and eating their fellows, was as old as mankind's fear of the dark, but no mythology I had ever read contained a reference to dog people. Strange fancies strike us in the moonlight sometimes. September ripened to October, and the moon, which had been as round and bright as an exchange-worn coin when I first visited the Squire's house, waned as thin as a shaving from a silversmith's lathe. I became a regular caller at the house in the pines. Indeed, I grew to look forward to my nightly visits with these homely folks as a welcome relief from the tedious companionship of the over-sophisticated people at the sanitarium. My habit of slipping away shortly after dinner was the cause of considerable comment and no little speculation on the part of my fellow convalescents, some of whom set it down to the eccentricity which, to their minds, was the inevitable ally of a minister's vocation, while others were frankly curious. Snatches of conversation I overheard now and then led me to believe that the objective of my strolls was the subject of wagering, and the guarded questions put to me in an effort to solve the mystery became more and more annoying. I had no intention of taking any of them to the farmhouse with me. The Squires were my friends. Their cheerful talk and unassuming manners were as delightful a contrast to the atmosphere of the sanitarium as a breath of mountain balsam after the fetid air of a hot house. But to the city-centered crowd at Briarcliff, they would have been only the objects of less than half-scornful patronage, the source of pitying amusement. It was Miss Leahy who pushed the impudent curiosity further than any of the rest, however. One evening, as I was setting out, she met me at the gate and announced her intention of going with me. "You must have found something dreadfully attractive to take you off every evening this way, Mr. Weatherby," she hazarded as she pursed her lips at me and caught step with my walk. "We girls really can't let some little country lass take you away from us, you know. We simply can't." I made no reply. I would not take her with me. To that I made up my mind. I would stop at the turn of the road, just out of the sight of the farmhouse, and cut across the fields. If she wanted to accompany me on a cross-country hike in high-heeled slippers, she was welcome to do so. Besides, she would tell the others that my wanderings were nothing more mysterious than nocturnal explorations of the nearby woods. Which bit of misinformation would satisfy the busybodies at Briarcliff and relieve me of the espionage to which I was subjected as well? I smiled grimly to myself as I pictured her climbing over fences and ditches in her flimsy frock and beaded pumps, and lengthened my stride toward the woods at the road's turn. We marched to the limits of the field bordering the squire's grove in silence. I thinking of the mild revenge I should soon wreak upon the little busybody at my side, Miss Leahy too intent on holding the pace I set to waste breath in conversation. As we neared the woods, she halted, an expression of worry, almost fear, coming over her face. "I don't believe I'll go any farther," she announced. "No?" I replied a trifle sarcastically. "And is your curiosity so easily satisfied?" "It's not that." She turned half round as if to retrace her steps. "But I'm afraid of those woods." "Indeed?" I queried. "And what is there to be afraid of? Bears or wildcats? I've been through them several times without seeing anything terrifying." Now that she had come this far, I was anxious to take her through the fields and underbrush. "No," Miss Leahy answered, a nervous quaver in her voice. "I'm not afraid of anything like that, but, oh, I don't know what you call it. Pierre told me all about it the other day. Some kind of dreadful thing. Loop, something or other. It's a French word, and I can't remember it." I was puzzled. Pierre Girant was the ancient French-Canadian gardener at the sanitarium, and, like all doddering old men, would talk for hours to anyone who would listen. Also, like all habitants, he was full of the wild folklore his ancestors brought overseas with them generations ago. "What did Pierre tell you?" I asked. "Why, he said that years ago some terrible people lived in these woods. They had the only house for miles around, and travelers stopped there for the night sometimes. But no stranger was ever seen to leave that place once he went in. One night, the farmers gathered around the house and burned it, with the family that lived there. When the embers had cooled down, they made a search, and found nearly a dozen bodies buried in the cellar. That was why no one ever came away from that dreadful place. They took the murdered men to the cemetery and buried them, but they dumped the charred bodies of the murderers into graves in the barnyard, without even saying a prayer over them. And Pierre says, oh, look." She broke off her recital of the old fellow's story and pointed a trembling hand across the field to the edge of the woods. A second more, and she shrank against me, clutching at my coat with fear-stiffened fingers and crying with excitement and terror. I looked in the direction she indicated, myself a little startled by the abject fear that had taken such sudden hold on her. Something white and ungainly was running diagonally across the field from us, skirting the margin of the woods and making for the meadow that adjoined the sanitarium pasture. A second glance told me it was a sheep, probably one of the flock kept to supply our table with fresh meat. I was laughing at the strength of the superstition that could make Miss Leahy see a figure of horror in an innocent mutton that had strayed away from its fellows and was scared out of its silly wits, when something else attracted my attention. Loping along in the trail of the fleeing sheep, somewhat to the rear and a little to each side, were two other animals. At first glance, they appeared to be a pair of large collies. But as I looked more intently, I saw that these animals were like nothing I had ever seen before. They were much larger than any collie, nearly as high as St. Bernards, yet shaped in a general way like Alaskan sledge dogs. The farther one was considerably the larger of the two, and ran with a slight limp, as if one of its hind paws had been injured. As nearly I could tell in the indifferent light, they were a rusty brown color, very thick-haired and unkempt in appearance. But the strangest thing about them was the fact that both were tailless, which gave them a terrifyingly grotesque look. As they ran, a third form, similar to the other two in shape, but smaller, slender as a greyhound, with much lighter-hued fur, broke from the thicket of the short bush edging the wood and took up the chase, emitting a series of short, sharp yelps.
Sheep killers, I murmured half to myself. Odd, I've never seen dogs like that before. They're not dogs, wailed Miss Leahy against my coat. They're not dogs. Oh, Mr. Weatherby, let's go away. Please, please take me home. She was rapidly becoming hysterical, and I had a difficult time with her on the trip back. She clung whimpering to me, and I had almost to carry her most of the way. By the time we reached the sanitarium, she was crying bitterly, shivering as with a chill, and went in without stopping to thank me for my assistance. I turned and made for the squire's farm with all possible speed, hoping to get there before the family had gone to bed. But when I arrived, the house was in darkness, and my knock at the door received no answer. As I retraced my steps to the sanitarium, I heard faintly, from the fields beyond the woods, the shrill, eerie cry of the sheep-killing dogs. A torrent of rain held us marooned the next day. Miss Leahy was confined to her room, with a nurse in constant attendance and the house doctor making hourly calls. She was on the verge of a nervous collapse, he told me, and responding to treatment very slowly. An impromptu dance was organized in the great hall, and half a dozen bridge tables set up in the library. But, as I was skilled in neither of these rainy day diversions, I put on a waterproof and patrolled the veranda for exercise. On my third or fourth trip around the house, I ran into old Girante shuffling across the porch, wagging his head and muttering portentously to himself. "See here, Pierre," I accosted him. "What sort of nonsense have you been telling Miss Leahy about those pine woods down the south road?" The old fellow regarded me unwinkingly with his dark eyes. "Monsieur goes out alone much at nights, n'est-ce pas?" he asked at length. "Yes, Monsieur goes out alone much at nights," I echoed. "But what Monsieur particularly desires to know is what sort of tales you have been telling Mademoiselle Leahy. Comprenez-vous?" The network of wrinkles around his lips multiplied as he smiled enigmatically, regarding me askance from the corner of his eyes. "Monsieur is Anglais," he replied. "He would not understand or believe." "Never mind what I'd believe," I retorted. "What is this story about murder and robbery being committed in these woods? Who were the murderers, and where did they live?" For a few seconds he looked fixedly at me, chewing the cud of senility between his toothless gums. Then, glancing carefully about, as if he feared being overheard, he tiptoed up to me and whispered, "Monsieur must stay indoors these nights. When the moon she shine, yes. When she not show her face, no. There are evil things abroad at the dark of the moon, monsieur. Even last night they killed 3 of my best sheep. Remember, monsieur, the loup-garou. He is out when the moon hide her light." And with that, he turned and left me. Nor could I get another word from him save his cryptic warning, "Remember, monsieur, the loup-garou. Remember." In spite of my annoyance, I could not get rid of the unpleasant sensation the old man's words left with me. The loup-garou. Werewolf, he had said, and to prove his goblin wolf's presence, he had cited the death of his 3 sheep. As I paced the rain-washed porch, I thought of the scene I had witnessed the night before, when the sheep-killers were at their work. Well, I reflected, I've seen the loup-garou on his native heath at last. From causes as slight as this, no doubt, the horrible legend of the werewolf had sprung. Time was when all France quaked at the sound of the loup-garou's hunting call, and the bravest knights in Christendom trembled in their castles and crossed themselves fearfully because some renegade shepherd dog quested his prey in the night. On such a foundation are the legends of people built. Whistling a snatch from Pinafore and looking skyward in search of a patch of blue in the clouds, I felt a tug at my raincoat sleeve, such as a neglected terrier might give. It was Girante again. "Monsieur, he began in the same mysterious whisper. "The loup-garou is a verity, certainly. I myself had never seen him." He paused to bless himself. "But my cousin Baptiste, he was once pursued by him. He was near the shrine of the good Saint Anne that Baptiste lived. One night he was sent to fetch the cure for a dying woman. They rode fast through the trees, the cure and my cousin Baptiste, for it was at the dark of the moon, and the evil forest folk were abroad. And as they galloped, there came a loup-garou from the woods, with eyes as bright as hellfire. It followed hard, this tailless hound, from the devil's kennel, but they reached the house before it, and the cure put his book, with the holy cross on its cover, at the doorstep. The loup-garou wailed under the windows like a child in pain until the sun rose. Then it slunk back to the forest. When my cousin Baptiste and the cure came out, they found its hand marks in the soft earth around the door, very like your hand or mine they were, monsieur, save that the first finger was longer than the others." "And did they find the loup-garou?" I asked. Something of the old man's earnestness communicated to me. "Oh, yes, monsieur, but of course," he replied gravely. 3 weeks before, a stranger drowned in the river. He had been buried without the office of the church. When they opened his grave, they found his fingernails as red as blood and sharp. Then they knew. The good cure read the burial office over him, and the poor soul that had been snatched away in sin slept peacefully at last." He looked quizzically at me, as if speculating whether to tell me more. Then, apparently fearing I would laugh at his outburst of confidence, he started away toward the kitchen. "Well, what else, Pierre?" I asked, feeling he had more to say. "Oh, there is nothing more, monsieur," he replied. "I did but want monsieur should know my own cousin Baptiste Herante had seen the loup-garou with his very eyes." "Hearsay evidence," I commented, as I went in to dinner. During the rainy week that followed, I chafed at my confinement like a privileged convict suddenly deprived of his liberties, and looked as wistfully down the south road as any prisoner ever gazed upon the open trail. The quiet home circle at the farmhouse, the unforced conversation of the old folks, Mildred's sweet companionship, all beckoned me with an almost irresistible force. For in this period of enforced separation, I discovered what I had dimly suspected for some time. I loved Mildred Squires, and, loving her, I longed to tell her of it. No lad intent on visiting his first sweetheart ever urged his feet more eagerly than I when, the curtains of rain at last drawn up, I hastened toward the house at the turn of the road. As I hoped, yet hardly dared expect, Mildred was standing at the gate to meet me as I rounded the curve, and I yearned toward her like a hummingbird seeking its nest. She must have read my heart in my eyes, for her greeting smile was tender as she reached out to meet me. "At last you have come, my friend," she said, putting out both hands in welcome. "I am very glad." We walked silently up the path, her fingers still resting in mine, her face averted. At the steps she paused, a little embarrassment in her voice as she explained. "Father and mother are out. They have gone to a meeting. But you will stay?" "Surely," I acquiesced, and to myself I admitted my gratitude for this chance of Mildred's unalloyed company. We talked but little that night. Mildred was strangely distant, and, much as I longed to, I could not force a confession of my love from my lips. Once, in the midst of a long pause between our words, the cry of the sheep killers came faintly to us, echoed across the fields and woods, and as the weird, shrill sound fell upon our ears, she threw back her head with something of the gesture of a hunting dog scenting its quarry. Toward midnight she turned to me, a panic of fear having apparently laid hold of her. You must go, she exclaimed, rising and laying her hand on my shoulder. But your father and mother have not returned, I objected. Won't you let me stay until they get back? Oh, no, no, she answered, her agitation increasing. You must go at once. Please. She increased her pressure on my shoulder, almost as if to shove me from the porch. Taken aback by her sudden desire to be rid of me, I was picking up my hat when she uttered a stifled scream and ran quickly to the edge of the porch, interposing herself between me and the yard. At the same moment, I heard a muffled sound from the direction of the front gate, a sound like a growling and snarling of savage dogs. I leaped forward, my first thought being that the sheep killers I had seen the other night had strayed to the squire's place. Crazed with blood, I knew they would be almost as dangerous to men as to sheep, and every nerve in my sickness-weakened body cried out to protect Mildred. To my blank amazement, as I looked from the porch, I beheld Mr. and Mrs. Squires walking sedately up the path, talking composedly together. There was no sign of the dogs or any other animals about. As the elderly couple neared the porch, I noticed that Mr. Squires walked with a pronounced limp, and that both their eyes shone very brightly in the moonlight, as though they were suffused with tears. They greeted me pleasantly enough, but Mildred's anxiety seemed increased rather than diminished by their presence, and I took my leave after a brief exchange of civilities. On my way back, I looked intently in the woods bordering the road for some sign of the house of which Pierre had told Miss Leahy, but everywhere the pines grew as thickly as though neither axe nor fire had ever disturbed them. Horante is in his second childhood, I reflected, and like an elder child, he loves to terrify his juniors with fearsome witch tales. Yet an uncomfortable feeling was with me till I saw the gleam of the sanitarium's lights across the field, and, as I walked toward them, it seemed to me that more than once I heard the baying of the sheep killers in the woods behind me. A buzz of conversation, like the sibilant arguments of a cloud of swarming bees, greeted me as I descended the stairs to breakfast next morning. It appeared that Ned, one of the pair of great mastiffs attached to the sanitarium, had been found dead before his kennel, his throat and brisket torn open and several gaping wounds in his flanks. Boris, his fellow, had been discovered whimpering and trembling in the extreme corner of the doghouse, the embodiment of canine terror. Speculation as to the animal responsible for the outrage was rife, and, as usual, it ran the gamut of possible and impossible surmises. Every sort of beast, from a grizzly bear to a lion escaped from the circus, was in turn indicted for the crime, only to have a complete alibi straightway established. The only one having no suggestion to offer was old Horante, who stood sphinx-like in the outskirts of the crowd, smiling sardonically to himself and wagging his head sagely. As he caught sight of me, he nodded sapiently, as if to include me in the joint tenancy to some weighty secret. Presently, he worked his way through the chattering crowd and whispered, "Monsieur, he was here last night, and with him the other tailless one. Come and see." Plucking me by the sleeve, he led me to the rear of the kennels and, stooping, pointed to something in the moist earth. "You see?" he asked, as if a printed volume lay for my reading in the mud. "I see that someone has been on his hands and knees here," I answered, inspecting the handprints he indicated. "Something," he corrected, as if reasoning with an obstinate child. "Does not Monsieur behold that the first finger is the longest?" "Which proves nothing," I defended. "There are many hands like that." "Oh, yes?" he replied with that queer upward accent of his. "And where has Monsieur seen hands like that before?"
"Oh, many times," I assured him somewhat vaguely, for there was a catch at the back of my throat as I spoke. Try as I would, I could recall only 3 pairs of hands with that peculiarity. His eyes rested steadily on me in an unwinking stare, and the corners of his mouth curved upward in a malicious grin. It seemed almost as if he found a grim pleasure in thus driving me into a corner. "See here, Pierre," I began testily, equally annoyed at myself and him. "You know as well as I that the loup-garou is an old wives' tale. Someone was looking here for tracks, and left his own while doing it. If we look among the patients here, we shall undoubtedly find a pair of hands to match these prints." "God forbid!" he exclaimed, crossing himself. "But that would be an evil day for us, monsieur. Here, Boris," he snapped his fingers to the surviving mastiff. "Come and eat." The huge beast came wallowing over to him with the ungainly gait of all heavily muscled animals, stopping on his way to make a nasal investigation of my knees. Scarcely had his nose come into contact with my trousers when he leapt back, every hair in his mane and along his spine stiffly erect, every tooth in his great mouth bared in a savage snarl. But instead of the mastiff's fighting growl, he emitted only a low, frightened whine, as though he were facing some animal of greater power than himself and knew his own weakness. "Good heavens!" I cried, thoroughly terrified at the friendly brute's sudden hostility. "Yes, monsieur," Horante cut in quickly, putting his hand on the dog's collar and leading him a few paces away. "It is well you should call upon the heavenly ones, for surely you have the odor of hell upon your clothes." "What do you mean?" I demanded angrily. "How dare you?" He raised a thin hand deprecatingly. "Monsieur knows that he knows," he replied evenly, "and that I also know." And, leading Boris by the collar, he shuffled to the house. Mildred was waiting for me at the gate that evening, and again her father and mother were absent at one of their meetings. We walked silently up the path and seated ourselves on the porch steps, where the waning moon cast oblique rays through the pine branches. I think Mildred felt the tension I was drawn to, for she talked trivialities with an almost feverish earnestness, stringing her sentences together and changing her subjects as a rug weaver twists and breaks its threads. At last I found an opening in the abatis of her small talk. "Mildred," I said very simply, for great emotions tear the ornaments from our speech, "I love you, and I want you for my wife. Will you marry me, Mildred?" I laid my hand on hers. It was cold as lifeless flesh, and seemed to shrink beneath my touch. "Surely, dear, you must have read the love in my eyes," I urged, as she averted her face in silence. "Almost from the night I first saw you, I've loved you. Don't." Her interruption was a strangled moan, as if wrung from her by my words. I leaned nearer her. "Don't you love me, Mildred?" I asked. As yet she had not denied it. For a moment she trembled, as if a sudden chill had come on her. Then, leaning to me, she clasped my shoulders in her arms, hiding her face against my jacket. John, you don't know what you say," she whispered disjointedly, as though a sob had torn the words before they left her lips. Her breath was on my cheek, moist and cold as air from a vault, and her body was as devoid of warmth as a dead thing. "You're cold," I told her, putting my arms shieldingly around her. "The night has chilled you." A convulsive sob was her only answer. "Mildred," I began again, putting my hand beneath her chin and lifting her face to mine, "tell me, what is the matter?" I lowered my lips to hers. With a cry that was half scream, half weeping, she thrust me suddenly from her, pressing her hands against my breast and lowering her head until her face was hidden between her outstretched arms. I, too, started back, for in the instant our lips were about to meet, hers had writhed back from her teeth like a dog's when he is about to spring, and a low, harsh noise, almost a growl, had risen in her throat. "For God's sake," she whispered hoarsely, agony in every note of her shaking voice, "never do that again. Oh, my dear, dear love, you don't know how near to a horror worse than death you were." "A horror worse than death?" I echoed dully, pressing her cold little hands in mine. "What do you mean, Mildred?" "Loose my hands," she commanded with a quaint reversion to the speech of our ancestors. "And hear me. I do love you. I love you better than life, better than death. I love you so I have overcome something stronger than the walls of the grave for your sake. But John, my very love, this is our last night together. We can never meet again. You must go, now, and not come back until tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning?" I repeated blankly. What wild talk was this? Heedless of my interruption, she hurried on. "Tomorrow morning, just before the sun rises over those trees, you must be here and have your prayer book with you." I listened, speechless, wondering which of us was mad. "By that corn crib there," she waved a directing hand, "you will find 3 mounds. Stand beside them and read the office for the burial of the dead. Come quickly and pause for nothing on the way. Look back for nothing, heed no sound from behind you, and for your own safety, come no sooner than to allow yourself the barest time to read your office." Bewildered, I attempted to reason with her, begged her to explain this folly, but she refused all answers to my fervid queries, nor would she suffer me to touch her. Finally, I rose to go. "You will do what I ask?" she implored. "Certainly not," I answered firmly. "John, John, have pity," she cried, flinging herself to the earth before me and clasping my knees. "You say you love me. I only ask this one favor of you, only this. Please, for my sake, for the peace of the dead and the safety of the living, promise you will do this thing for me." Shaken by her abject supplication, I promised, though I felt myself a figure in some grotesque nightmare as I did it. "Oh, my love, my precious love," she wept, rising and taking both my hands. "At last I shall have peace, and you shall bring it to me." "No," she forbade as I made to take her in my arms at parting. "The most I can give you is this." She held her icy hands against my lips. "It seems so little, dear, but oh, it is so much." Like a drunkard, I staggered along the south road, my thoughts gone wild with the strangeness of the play I had just acted. Across the clearing came the howls of the sheep killers, a sound I had grown used to of late. But tonight there was a deeper, fiercer timbre in their bay, a note that boded ill for man as well as beast. Louder and louder it swelled. It was rising from the field itself, now drawing nearer and nearer the road. I turned and looked. The great beasts I had seen pursuing the luckless sheep the other night were galloping toward me. A cold finger seemed traced down my spine. The scalp crept and tingled beneath my cap. There was no other object of their quest in sight. I was their elected prey. My first thought was to turn and run, but a second's reasoning told me this was worse than useless. Weakened with long illness, with an uphill road to the nearest shelter, I should soon be run down. No friendly tree offered asylum. My only hope was to stand and fight. Grasping my stick, I spread my feet, bracing myself against their charge. And as I waited their onslaught, there came from the shadow of the pines the shriller, sharper cry of the third beast. Like the crest of a flying wind-lashed wave, the slighter, silver-furred animal came speeding across the meadow, its ears laid back, its slender paws spurning the sod daintily. Almost, it seemed, as if the pale shadow of a cloud were racing toward me. The thing dashed slantwise across the field, its flight converging on the line of the other two's attack. Midway between me and them it paused, hairs bristling, limbs bent for a spring. My eyes went wide with incredulity. It was standing in my defense. All the savageness of the larger beast's hunting cry was echoed in the smaller creature's bay, and with it a defiance that needed no interpretation. The attackers paused in their rush, halted, and looked speculatively at my ally. They took a few tentative steps in my direction, and a fierce whine, almost an articulate curse, went up from the silver-haired beast. Slowly, the tawny pair circled and trotted back to the woods. I hurried toward the sanitarium, grasping my stick firmly in readiness for another attack. But no further cries came from the woods, and once, as I glanced back, I saw the light-haired beast trotting slowly in my wake, looking from right to left, as if to ward off danger. Half an hour later, I looked from my window toward the house in the pines. Far down the south road, its muzzle pointed to the moon, the bright-furred animal crouched and poured out a lament to the night, and its cry was like the wail of a child in pain. Far into the night I paced my room, like a condemned convict when the vigil of the death watch is on him. Reason and memory struggled for the mastery, one urging me to give over my wild act, the other bidding me obey my promise to Mildred. Toward morning, I dropped into a chair, exhausted with my objectless marching. I must have fallen asleep, for when I started up, the stars were dimming in the zenith, and bands of slate, shading to amethyst, slanted across the horizon. A moment I paused, laughing cynically at my fool's errand. Then, seizing cap and book, I bolted down the stairs and ran through the paling dawn to the house in the pines. There was something ominous and terrifying in the two-toned pastel of the house that morning. Its windows stared at me with blank malevolence, like the half-closed eyes of one stricken dead in mortal sin. The little patches of hoarfrost on the lawn were like infectious spots on some unclean thing. From the trees behind the clearing, an owl hooted mournfully, as if to say, "Beware, beware," and the wind sighing through the black pine boughs echoed the refrain ceaselessly. 3 mounds, sunken and weed-grown, lay in the unkempt thicket behind the corn crib. I paused beside them, throwing off my cap and adjusting my stole hastily. Thumbing the pages to the committal service, I held the book close that I might see the print through the morning shadows, and commenced, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." Almost beside me, under the branches of the pines, there rose such a chorus of howls and yelps I nearly dropped my book. Like all the hounds in the kennels of hell, the sheep-killers clamored at me, rage and fear and mortal hatred in their eyes. Through the bestial cadences, too, there seemed to run a human note, the sound of voices heard before beneath these very trees. Deep and throaty and raging mad, 2 of the voices came to me, and, like the tremolo of a violin lightly played in an orchestra of brass, the shriller cry of a third beast sounded. As the infernal wailing rose at my back, I half turned to fly. Next instant, I grasped my book more firmly and resumed my office, for, like a beacon in the dark, Mildred's words flashed on my memory. Look back for nothing, heed no sound behind you. Strangely, too, the din approached no nearer, but as though held by an invisible bar, stayed at the boundary of the clearing. Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live and is full of misery. Deliver us from all our offenses. O Lord, deliver us not into the bitter pains of eternal death. And to such an accompaniment, surely, as no priest ever before chanted the office, I pressed through the brief service to the final Amen. Tiny beads of moisture stood out on my forehead, and my breath struggled in my throat as I gasped out the last word. My nerves were frayed to shreds, and my strength nearly gone as I let fall my book and turned upon the beasts among the trees. They were gone. Abruptly as it had begun, their clamor stopped, and only the rotting pine needles, lightly gilded by the morning sun, met my gaze. A light touch fell in the palm of my open hand, as if a pair of cool, sweet lips had laid a kiss there. A vapor-like swamp fog enveloped me. The outbuildings, the old stone-curbed well where I had drunk the night I first saw Mildred, the house itself, all seemed fading into mist and swirling away in the morning breeze. Monsieur will do himself an injury sleeping on the wet earth. Old Horante bent over me, his arm beneath my shoulders. Behind him, great Boris, the mastiff, stood wagging his tail, regarding me with doggish good humor. Pierre, I muttered thickly, how came you here? This morning, going to my tasks, I saw Monsieur run down the road like a thing pursued. I followed quickly, for the woods hold terrors in the dark, Monsieur. I looked toward the farmhouse. Only a pair of chimneys, rising stark and bare from a crumbling foundation, were there. Fence, wall, barn, all were gone, and in their place was a thicket of sumac and briars, tangled and overgrown as though undisturbed for 30 years. The house! Pierre, where is the house? I croaked, sinking my fingers into his withered arm. House? He echoed. Oh, but of course, there is no house here, monsieur, nor has there been for years. This is an evil place, monsieur. It is best we quit it, and that quickly. There be evil things that run by night. No more, I answered, staggering toward the road, leaning heavily on him. I brought them peace, Pierre. He looked dubiously at the prayer book I held. Something of the heart-sick misery in my face must have touched his kind old heart, for at last he relented, shaking his head pityingly and patting my shoulder gently, as one would soothe a sorrowing child. Perhaps, monsieur, he conceded. Who shall say no? Love and sorrow are the purchase price of peace. Yes, did not le bon Dieu so buy the peace of the world? Wolves Don't Cry by Bruce Elliott, 1954. The naked man behind the bars was sound asleep. In the cage next to him, a bear rolled over on its back and peered sleepily at the rising sun. Not far away, a jackal paced springily back and forth as though essaying the impossible, trying to leave its own stench far behind. Flies were gathering around the big bone that rested near the man's sleeping head. Little bits of decaying flesh attracted the insects, and their hungry buzzing made the man stir uneasily. Accustomed to instant awakening, his eyes flickered, and simultaneously his right hand darted out and smashed down at the irritating flies. They left in a swarm, But the naked man stayed frozen in the position he had assumed. His eyes were on his hand. He was still that way when the zoo attendant came close to the cage. The attendant, a pail of food in one hand, a pail of water in the other, said, "Hi, Lobo, up and at 'em. The customers'll be here soon." Then he, too, froze. Inside the naked man's head, strange ideas were stirring. His paw, what had happened to it? Where was the stiff gray hair, the jet-black, steel-strong nails? And what was the odd fifth thing that jutted out from his paw at right angles? He moved it experimentally. It rotated. He'd never been able to move his dew claw, and the fact that he could move this fifth extension was somehow more baffling than the other oddities that were puzzling him. "You goddamn drunks," the attendant raved. "Wasn't bad enough the night a flock of you came in here and a girl bothered the bear and lost an arm for her trouble. No, that wasn't bad enough. Now you have to sleep in my cages. And where's Lobo? What have you done with him?" The naked figure wished the two-legged would stop barking. It was enough trouble trying to figure out what had happened without the angry, short barks of the two-legged who fed him, interfering with his thoughts. Then there were many more of the two-leggeds and a lot of barking, and the naked one wished they'd all go away and let him think. Finally, the cage was opened, and the two-leggeds tried to make him come out of his cage. He retreated hurriedly on all fours to the back of his cage toward his den. "Let him alone," the two-legged who fed him barked. "Let him go into Lobo's den. He'll be sorry." Inside the den, inside the hollowed-out rock that so cleverly approximated his home before he had been captured, he paced back and forth, finding it bafflingly uncomfortable to walk on his naked feet. His paws did not grip the ground the way that they should have, and the rock hurt his new soft pads. The two-legged ones were getting angry. He could smell the emotion as it poured from them, but even that was puzzling, for he had to flare his nostrils wide to get the scent, and it was blurred, not crisp and clear the way he ordinarily smelled things. Throwing back his head, he howled in frustration and anger, but the sound was wrong. It did not ululate as was its wont. Instead, he found to his horror that he sounded like a cub or a female. What had happened to him? Cutting one of his soft pads on a stone, he lifted his foot and licked at the blood. His pounding heart almost stopped. This was no wolf blood. Then the two-legged ones came in after him, and the fight was one that ordinarily he would have enjoyed, but now his heart was not in it. Dismay filled him, for the taste of his own blood had put fear in him. Fear unlike any he had ever known, even when he was trapped that time and put in a box and thrown onto a wheeled thing that had rocked back and forth and smelled so badly of two-legged things. This was a new fear, and a horrible one. Their barking got louder when they found that he was alone in his den. Over and over they barked, not that he could understand them. "What have you done with Lobo? Where is he? Have you turned him loose?" It was only after a long time, when the sun was riding high in the summer sky, that he was wrapped in a foul-smelling thing and put in a four-wheeled object and taken away from his den. He would never have thought, when he was captured, that he would ever miss the new home that the two-leggeds had given him, but he found that he did. And most of all, as the four-wheeled thing rolled through the city streets, he found himself worrying about his mate in the next cage. What would she think when she found him gone, and she just about to have a litter? He knew that most males did not worry about their young, but wolves were different. No mother wolf ever had to worry, the way female bears did, about a male wolf eating his young. No, indeed, wolves were different. And being different, he found that worse than being tied up in a cloth and thrown in the back of a long-wheeled thing was the worry he felt about his mate and her young-to-be. But worse was to come. When he was carried out of the moving thing, the two-legged ones carried him into a big building, and the smells that surged in on his outraged nostrils literally made him cringe. There was sickness, and stenches worse than he had ever smelled, and above and beyond all other smells, the odor of death was heavy in the long white corridors through which he was carried. Seeing around him as he did ordinarily in grays and blacks and whites, he found that the new sensations that crashed against his smarting eyeballs were not to be explained by anything he knew. Not having the words for red and green and yellow, for pink and orange and all the other colors in a polychromatic world, not having any idea of what they were, just served to confuse him even more miserably. He moaned. The smells, the discomfort, the horror of being handled were as nothing against the hurt his eyes were enduring. Lying on a flat, hard thing, he found that it helped just to stare directly upwards. At least the flat covering 10 feet above him was white, and he could cope with that. The two-legged thing sitting next to him had a gentle bark, but that didn't help much. The two-legged said patiently over and over again, "Who are you? Have you any idea? Do you know where you are? What day is this?" After a while the barks became soothing, and, nude no longer, wrapped now in a long wet sheet that held him cocoon-like in its embrace, he found that his eyes were closing. It was all too much for him. He slept. The next awakening was, if anything, worse than the first. First, he thought that he was back in his cage in the zoo, for directly ahead of him he could see bars. Heaving a sigh of vast relief, he wondered what had made an adult wolf have such an absurd dream. He could still remember his puppyhood, when sleep had been made peculiar by a life unlike the one he enjoyed when awake. The twitchings, the growls, the sleepy murmurs. He had seen his own sons and daughters go through them, and they had reminded him of his youth. But now the bars were in front of him, and all was well. Except that he must have slept in a peculiar position. He was stiff, and when he went to roll over, he fell off the hard thing he had been on and crashed to the floor. Bars or no bars, this was not his cage. That was what made the second awakening so difficult, for, once he had fallen off the hospital bed, he found that his limbs were encumbered by a long garment that flapped around him as he rolled to all fours and began to pace fearfully back and forth inside the narrow confines of the cell that he now inhabited. Worse yet, when the sound of his fall reached the ears of a two-legged one, he found that some more two-legs hurried to his side, and he was forced, literally forced, into an odd garment that covered his lower limbs. Then they made him sit on the end of his spine, and it hurt cruelly. And they put a metal thing in his right paw, and wrapped the soft flesh of his paw around the metal object, and, holding both, they made him lift some kind of slop from a round thing on the flat surface in front of him. That was bad, but the taste of the mush they forced into his mouth was grotesque. Where was his meat? Where was his bone? How could he sharpen his fangs on such food as this? What were they trying to do, make him lose his teeth? He gagged and regurgitated the slops. That didn't do the slightest bit of good. The two-leggeds kept right on forcing the mush into his aching jaws. Finally, in despair, he kept some of it down. Then they made him balance on his hind legs. He'd often seen the bear in the next cage doing this trick, and sneered at the big fat oaf for pandering to the two-leggeds by aping them. Now he found that it was harder than he would have thought. But finally, after the two-leggeds had worked with him for a long time, he found that he could, by much teetering, stand erect. But he didn't like it. His nose was too far from the floor, and with whatever it was wrong with his smelling, he found that he had trouble sniffing the ground under him. From this distance he could not track anything, not even a rabbit. If one had run right by him, he thought, feeling terribly sorry for himself, he'd never be able to smell it, or, if he did, be able to track it down, no matter how fat and juicy. For how could a wolf run on 2 legs? They did many things to him in the new big zoo, and in time he found that, dislike it as much as he did, they could force him by painful expedients to do many of the tasks they set him. That, of course, did not help him to understand why they wanted him to do such absurd things as encumber his legs with cloth that flapped and got in the way, or balance precariously on his hind legs, or any of the other absurdities they made him perform. But somehow he surmounted everything, and in time even learned to bark a little the way they did. He found that he could bark, "Hello," and "I'm hungry," and, after months of effort, ask, "Why can't I go back to the zoo?" But that didn't do much good, because all they ever barked back was, "Because you're a man." Now, of many things he was unsure since that terrible morning, but of one thing he was sure. He was a wolf. Other people knew it too. He found this out on the day some outsiders were let into the place where he was being kept. He had been sitting, painful as it was, on the tip of his spine, in what he had found the 2-leggeds called a chair, when some shes passed by. His nostrils closed at the sweet smell that they had poured on themselves, but through it he could detect the real smell, the female smell, and his nostrils had flared, and he had run to the door of his cell, and his eyes had become red as he looked at them. Not so attractive as his mate, but at least they were covered with fur, not like the peeled ones that he sometimes saw dressed in stiff, white, crackling things. The fur-covered ones had giggled just like ripening she-cubs, and his paws had ached to grasp them, and his jaws ached to bite into their fur-covered necks. One of the fur-covered 2-leggeds had giggled, "Look at that wolf!" So some of the 2-leggeds had perception, and could tell that the ones who held him in this big strange zoo were wrong, that he was not a man, but a wolf. Inflating his now puny lungs to the utmost, he had thrown back his head and roared out a challenge that in the old days, in the forest, would have sent a thrill of pleasure through every female for miles around. But instead of that blood-curdling, stomach-wrenching roar, a little barking, choking sound came from his throat. If he had still had a tail, it would have curled down under his belly as he slunk away. The first time they let him see himself in what they called a mirror, he had moaned like a cub. Where was his long snout? The bristling whiskers, the flat head, the pointed ears? What was this thing that stared with dilated eyes out of the flat, shiny surface? White-faced, almost hairless, save for a jet-black bar of eyebrows that made a straight line across his high, round forehead, small-jawed, small-toothed. He knew with a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach that even a year-old would not hesitate to challenge him in the mating fights. Not only challenge him, but beat him. For how could he fight with those little canines, those feeble, white, hairless paws? Another thing that irritated him, as it would any wolf, was that they kept moving him around. He would no sooner get used to one den and make it his own, but they'd move him to another one. The last one that contained him had no bars. If he had been able to read his chart, he would have known that he was considered on the way to recovery, that the authorities thought him almost cured of his aberration. The den with no bars was one that was used for limited liberty patients. They were on a kind of parole basis. But he had no idea of what the word meant, and the first time he was released on his own cognizance, allowed to make a trip out into the real world, he put out of his mind the curious forms of occupational therapy with which the authorities were deviling him. His daytime liberty was unreal, and dragged by in a way that made him almost anxious to get back home to the new den. He had all but made up his mind to do so, when the setting sun conjured up visions which he could not resist. In the dark, he could get down on all fours. Leaving the crowded city streets behind him, he hurried out into the suburbs where the spring smells were making the night air exciting. He had looked forward so to dropping on all fours and racing through the velvet spring night that when he did so, only to find that all the months of standing upright had made him too stiff to run, he could have howled. The clumsy leather things on his back paws got in the way, and he would have ripped them off, but he remembered how soft his new pads were, and he was afraid of what would happen to them. Forcing himself upright, keeping the curve in his back that he had found helped him to stand on his hind legs, he made his way cautiously along a flat thing that stretched off into the distance. The four-wheeler that stopped near him would ordinarily have frightened him, but even his new weak nose could sniff through the rank, acrid smells of the four-wheeler and find, under the too sweet something on the two-legged female, the real smell, so that when she said, "Hop in, I'll give you a lift," he did not run away. Instead, he joined the she. Her bark was nice, and later, while he was doing to her what she said she wanted done to her, her moans of pleasure became loud, and it hurt even his new dull ears. They got fainter as he tried to run off on his hind legs. It was not much faster than a walk, but he had to get some of the good feeling of the air against his face, of his lungs panting. He had to run. Regret was in him that he would not be able to get food for the she, and be near her when she whelped, for that was the way of a wolf. But he knew, too, that he would always know her by her scent, and if possible, when her time came, he would be at her side. Not even the spring running was as it should be, for without the excitement of being on all fours, without the nimbleness that had been his, he found that he stumbled too much. There was no thrill. And besides, all around him, the manifold smells told him that many of the two-leggeds were all jammed together. The odor was like a miasma, and not even the all-pervading stench that came from the four-wheelers could drown it out. Coming to a halt, he sat on his haunches, and for the first time he wondered if he were really, as he knew he was, a wolf, for a salty wetness was making itself felt at the corners of his eyes. Wolves don't cry. But if he were not a wolf, what then was he? What were all the memories that crowded his sick brain? Tears or no, he knew that he was a wolf, and being a wolf, he must rid himself of this soft pelt, this hairlessness that made him sick at his stomach just to touch it with his two soft pads. This was his dream, to become again as he had been, to be what was his only reality, a wolf with a wolf's life and a wolf's loves. That was his first venture into the reality of the world at large. His second day and night of limited liberty sent him hurrying back to his den. Nothing in his wolf life had prepared him for what he found in the midnight streets of the big city. For he found that bears were not the only males from whom the shes had to protect their young. And no animal of which he had ever heard could have moaned as he heard a man moan. If only pain didn't hurt so much. And the strangled cries, the thrashing of limbs, the violence, and the sound of a whip. He had never known that humans used whips on themselves, too. The third time out, he tried to drug himself the way the two-leggeds did by going to a big place where, on a screen, black and white shadows went through imitations of reality. He didn't go to a show that advertised it was in full, glorious color, for he found the other shadows in neutral grays and blacks and whites gave a picture of life the way his wolf eyes were used to looking at it. It was in this big place where the shadows acted that he found that perhaps he was not unique. His eyes glued to the screen, he watched as a man slowly fell to all fours, threw his head back, bayed at the moon, and then, right before everyone, turned into a wolf. A werewolf, the man was called in the shadow play. And if there were werewolves, he thought, as he sat frozen in the middle of all the seated two-leggeds, then, of course, there must be weremen. Would that be the word? And he was one of them. On the screen, the melodrama came to its quick, bloody, foreordained end, and the werewolf died when shot by a silver bullet. He saw the fur disappear from the skin, and the paws change into hands and feet. All he had to do, he thought as he left the theater, his mind full of his dream, was to find out how to become a wolf again, without dying. Meanwhile, on every trip out without fail, he went to the zoo. The keepers had become used to seeing him. They no longer objected when he threw little bits of meat into the cage to his pups. At first, his she had snarled when he came near the bars, but after a while, although still puzzled, and even though she flattened her ears and sniffed constantly at him, she seemed to become resigned to having him stand as near the cage as he possibly could. His pups were coming along nicely, almost full-grown. He was sorry, in a way, that they had to come to wolfhood behind bars, for now they'd never know the thrill of the spring running. But it was good to know they were safe, and had full bellies, and a den to call their own. It was when his cubs were almost ready to leave their mother that he found the two-leggeds had a place of books. It was called a library, and he had been sent there by the woman in the hospital who was teaching him and some of the other aphasics how to read and write and speak. Remembering the shadow play about the werewolf, he forced his puzzled eyes to read all that he could find on the baffling subject of lycanthropy. In every time, in every clime, he found that there were references to two-leggeds who had become four-leggeds, wolves, tigers, panthers, but never a reference to an animal that had become a two-legged. In the course of his reading, he found directions whereby a two-legged could change himself. They were complicated and meaningless to him. They involved curious things like a belt made of human skin, with a certain odd number of nail heads arranged in a quaint pattern on the body of the belt. The buckle had to be made under peculiar circumstances, and there were many chants that had to be sung. It was essential, he read in the crabbed old books, that the two-legged desirous of making the change go to a place where two roads intersected at a specific angle. Then, standing at the intersection, chanting the peculiar words, feeling the human skin belt, the two-legged was told to divest himself of all clothing, and then to relieve his bladder. Only then, the old books said, could the change take place. He found that his heart was beating madly when he finished the last of the old books. For if a two-legged could become a four-legged, surely... After due thought, which was painful, he decided that a human skin belt would be wrong for him. The man in the fur store looked at him oddly when he asked for a length of wolf fur, long and narrow, capable of being made into a belt. But he got the fur, and he made the pattern of nail heads, and he did the things the books had described. It was lucky, he thought as he stood in the deserted zoo, that not far from the cages he had found two roads that cut into each other in just the manner that the books said that they should. Standing where they crossed, his clothes piled on the grass nearby, the belt around his narrow waist, his fingers caressing its fur, his human throat chanting the meaningless words, he found that standing naked was a cold business, and that it was easy to void his bladder, as the books had said that he must. And then, it was all over. He had done everything just as he should. At first, nothing happened, and the cold white moon looked down at him, and fear rode up and down his spine that he would be seen by one of the two-leggeds who always wore blue clothes, and he would be taken and put back in that other zoo that was not a zoo, even though it had bars on the windows. But then an aching began in his erect back, and he fell to all fours, and the agony began, and the pain blinded him to everything, to all the strange functional changes that were going on, and it was a long, long time before he dared open his eyes. Even before he opened them, he could sense that it had happened. For crisp and clear through the night wind, he could smell as he knew he should be able to smell. The odors came, and they told him old stories. Getting up on all fours, paying no attention to the clothes that now smelled foully of the two-leggeds, he began to run. His strong claws scrabbled at the cement, and he hurried to the grass, and it was wonderful and exciting to feel the good feel of the growing things under his pads. Throwing his long head back, he closed his eyes, and from deep, deep inside, he sang a song to the wolves' god, the moon. His baying excited the animals in the cages so near him, and they began to roar and scream, and those sounds were good too. Running through the night, aimlessly, but running, feeling the ground beneath his paws was good, so good. And then, through the sounds, through all the baying and roaring and screaming from the animals, he heard his she's voice. And he forgot about freedom and the night wind and the cool white moon, and he ran back to the cage where she was. The zoo attendants were just as baffled when they found the wolf curled up outside the cage near the feeding trough as it had been when they had found the man in the wolf's cage. The two-legged who was his keeper recognized him, and he was allowed to go back into his cage, and then the ecstasy, the spring and fall-time ecstasy of being with his she. Slowly, as he became used to his wolfhood again, he forgot about the life outside the cage, and soon it was all a matter that only arose in his troubled dreams. And even then his she was there to nuzzle him and wake him if the nightmares got too bad. Only once, after the first few days, did any waking memory of his two-legged life return, and that was when a two-legged she passed by his cage, pushing a small four-wheeler in front of her. Her scent was familiar. So, too, was the scent of the two-legged cub. Darting to the front of his cage, he sniffed long and hard, and for just a moment, the woman who was pushing the preambulator that contained her bastard looked deep into his yellow eyes, and she knew, as he did, who and what he was. And the very, very last thought he had about the matter was one of infinite pity for his poor cub, who some white moonlit night was going to drop down on all fours and become furred and go prowling through the dark in search of what he would never know.
No, please don't wear that.
What's the matter?
I know you'll think I'm crazy, but in a half an hour the moon will rise and I'll turn into a wolf.
You and 20 million other guys.
Listen, I might tear you limb from limb.